It's funny, the things that have weight. For 25 years, the heaviest thing in my world was my family's name, Blackwood. It was a name that opened doors, a name whispered with reverence in the old, humid corners of Charleston. But for me, Colette Blackwood, it was never a key. It was an anchor. It was a constant, crushing reminder of what I wasn't. I was the scholarship kid, the charity case, the living embodiment of the family's dirty little secret, that not all Blackwoods were created equal. They would say my name, Colette, and it would hang in the air with a faint, unspoken pity, like a ghost at their lavish feasts. But today, the heaviest thing I own is this small, ugly piece of rusted metal resting in my palm. It's an old key, pitted and brown, with a simple stamped number on its bow. It's the only thing my Grandma Rose left me. To my family, it was proof of her poverty, the final, pathetic punchline to the joke of my side of the family. To me, it's the key to everything. They think I'm walking into the annual family trust meeting this afternoon to beg for scraps, to give my yearly report on how their educational fund is being put to good use. They are about to find out that the scholarship kid is coming to collect on a debt they didn't even know they owed. The last family gathering before everything changed was Easter. It was like all Blackwood events, a masterclass in passive aggression and performative opulence. It was held at the ancestral home, a sprawling mansion dripping with Spanish moss and suffocating tradition, the one my Uncle Sterling and Aunt Priscilla had inherited. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and old money. I had driven there in my 10-year-old sedan, the one that always made a slight clicking sound when I turned left, and parked it as far down the crushed shell driveway as possible, hoping it wouldn't offend the polished sensibilities of the Jaguars and Mercedes that lined the entrance. Inside, the scene was exactly as I'd pictured it. My Aunt Priscilla, a woman who seemed to be constructed entirely of sharp angles and silk, was holding court by the grand piano. My Uncle Sterling, a large man whose face was perpetually flushed with expensive port and self-satisfaction, was laughing a booming laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. Their children, my cousins Caspian and Beatrice, were the stars of the show. Caspian, smug and preening in a blazer that cost more than my semester's rent, was recounting a tedious story about his polo match. Beatrice, the golden child, beautiful and brittle, was showing off a new diamond bracelet, a little something from her fiancé's family. I tried to melt into the floral wallpaper, a survival tactic I'd honed over 2 decades of these gatherings. But Sterling's eyes found me. "Colette, there you are, my dear girl," he boomed, striding over. His hand landed on my head, not just a pat, but a deliberate, condescending press, as if I were a cocker spaniel he was commending for not making a mess on the Persian rug. "Still hitting the books, are we? That's my girl, building character." He winked at a nearby guest, a man with a face like a collapsed pudding. "Our Colette is the smart one, got herself a full scholarship to the university, didn't have to touch a penny of her educational trust. Character, you see." The words were meant to sound like a compliment, but we all knew what they were. They were a reminder. You are the one who needs scholarships. You are the one who needs a character-building educational trust. You are not like us. Aunt Priscilla glided over, her smile as thin as a razor's edge. "Beatrice was just telling us about her trip to Milan. Colette, the new collections are simply divine. You must be so busy with your studies, you probably don't have time for such frivolities." Frivolities. My life was a series of carefully managed necessities. My side hustle, a small but growing baking business, I ran out of my tiny apartment kitchen, paid for my books and my car insurance. My 2 part-time jobs, one at the university library, and one waiting tables, paid for my food and rent. Frivolity wasn't in my vocabulary, I just smiled, a tight, practiced expression I had perfected for these moments. "It sounds lovely, Aunt Priscilla. I'm just focusing on midterms right now." Caspian drifted by, a champagne flute in his hand. He glanced out the window towards the driveway. "Heard a bit of a racket when you pulled in, Colette. Everything all right with that vehicle of yours?" He said vehicle, with the same distaste he might use for swamp vermin. That was my family, a collection of perfectly polished surfaces, designed to reflect my own inadequacies back at me. I was their mirror, the one that showed them how bright and shiny they were by comparison. And the worst part, the part that truly ate at me, was that I let them do it. I stood there, I smiled, I took the head pats and the backhanded compliments, because a small desperate part of me still craved their approval. A part of me still believed that if I was smart enough, quiet enough, and unobtrusive enough, they might one day see me as just family. The call came 2 weeks later. It wasn't from Sterling or Priscilla, it was from a hospice nurse. Grandma Rose was gone. My grandmother, my only real connection to the Blackwood name that felt like love instead of an obligation, had passed away peacefully in her sleep. My Rose, who lived in a tiny, cluttered bungalow on the other side of town, the side of town the rest of the family pretended didn't exist. She was my great-grandfather Jonathan's granddaughter, just as Sterling was my great-uncle Reginald's grandson. But in the calculus of our family, that simple fact of lineage was weighted very, very differently. I called Uncle Sterling to tell him. There was a long, weary sigh on the other end of the line. "Oh dear," he said, his voice laced with the inconvenience of it all. "Rose, yes. Well, she was quite old, wasn't she? Thank you for letting us know, Colette. Priscilla and I will see what we can do." What they could do, it turned out, was show up to the funeral for a grand total of 7 minutes. They swept in, a trinity of tailored black, Priscilla, Sterling, and Caspian. Beatrice, I was told, had a prior charitable commitment. They didn't speak to me. They nodded curtly at the few neighbors and friends of Rose who had gathered in the small, humble chapel. Sterling checked his watch twice. Priscilla looked at a small smudge on the pew in front of her with undisguised horror. Then, as quickly as they had arrived, they swept out again, leaving a wake of expensive cologne and chilling indifference. They didn't even attend the burial. The will reading was a week later, in the stuffy, book-lined office of Rose's lawyer, a kindly old man named Mr. Abernathy. I was there, along with Rose's next-door neighbor, a sweet woman named Carol. The Blackwoods didn't deign to appear themselves. They sent a junior associate from their massive corporate law firm, a young man with slicked-back hair and an air of profound boredom. He spent the entire time scrolling through his phone. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat and read from the simple typewritten document. Rose's collection of porcelain birds went to Carol. Her modest savings, a few $1,000s, were to be donated to the local animal shelter. The house, which was heavily mortgaged, would be sold to cover her debts. And then he came to me, and to my beloved granddaughter, Colette Blackwood, he read, his voice softening. "I leave the most valuable thing I have ever possessed. I leave her my hope for the future, a truth contained in the past. I leave her my old lockbox key. May she have the courage to turn it." He slid a small manila envelope across the desk. Inside was the key. It was ugly, old, and to all appearances, worthless. The junior associate from my uncle's firm actually let out a small, derisive snort. He didn't even try to hide it. He looked at me, a smirk playing on his lips, as if to say, "Of course, the charity case gets a piece of junk." He stood up, adjusted his tie, and said, "Well, if that's all, I have a tea time to get to." He walked out, without a backward glance. And in that moment, sitting in that dusty office with a rusty key in my hand, the full weight of their betrayal crashed down on me. It wasn't just the condescension. It wasn't just the pity. It was the totality of their dismissal. My grandmother, a Blackwood by blood, was nothing to them. Her life, her memory, her legacy, all of it was an inconvenience, a piece of social awkwardness to be dealt with as swiftly as possible. And I, by extension, was nothing. The key wasn't a joke, it was a judgment. It was the final confirmation of my status. I was the girl who inherited rust. I drove home in a daze, the little key cold in my hand. My apartment, usually my sanctuary, felt like a cage. It was a small one-bedroom on the third floor of a walk-up, with second-hand furniture and posters taped to the walls. It was neat and clean, but it was a world away from the Blackwood mansion, with its soaring ceilings and ancestral portraits. I stood in the middle of my living room, the silence pressing in on me. I looked at the key again, turning it over and over. It wasn't just a key, it was a symbol of everything, a symbol of their contempt. And then, the dam broke. I sank onto my threadbare sofa, and I wept. It was a raw, ugly cry, torn from a place of deep old hurt. I cried for my grandmother, for the quiet dignity of her life that they had so casually spat upon. I cried for my father, her son, a gentle, bookish man, who had died too young, and who had spent his life believing he was a disappointment to the great Blackwood name. But mostly, I cried for myself, for the little girl who just wanted to be loved by her family, for the teenager who studied until her eyes burned to prove she was worthy, for the young woman who was still, after all these years, standing on the outside looking in. The grief was a physical thing, a hollow ache in my chest. They had finally done it. They had made me feel as worthless as they always believed I was. My own grandmother, the last person I thought loved me unconditionally, had left me with a final cryptic insult, a riddle wrapped in rust. The key sat on my desk for 3 weeks, a tiny brown accusation. I tried to ignore it. I threw myself into my studies, into my baking, into my shifts at the library. I worked until I was so exhausted that I would fall into bed and sleep a dreamless, leaden sleep. I needed to build a wall around that hollow space in my chest, and I was using bricks of pure, relentless activity. During those weeks, the ghosts of every past humiliation came to visit. Memory is a funny thing. It buries the everyday slights under the weight of routine. But grief has a way of excavating them with surgical precision. I remembered Christmas when I was 8. Caspian got a pedigreed beagle puppy with a red bow around its neck. Beatrice got a life-sized dollhouse, an exact replica of the main family home. I got a savings bond for $50 and a beige sweater. Practical, Uncle Sterling had declared, ruffling my hair with that same proprietary air. It's important for Colette to understand the value of $1. She won't have a trust fund to fall back on like these two little scamps. He'd laughed his booming laugh, and Caspian had paraded the puppy in front of me, its warm, wriggling body, a symbol of a life of casual, thoughtless receiving that I would never know. I'd spent the rest of the day in a quiet corner, stroking the sleeve of my sensible sweater, feeling the sting of the word practical, like a slap. Then there was the memory of applying to colleges. I was 17, with a nearly perfect GPA and a list of extracurriculars a mile long. I had dreamed of going to a top-tier liberal arts college in New England. I showed my acceptance letter to Aunt Priscilla, my heart thumping with pride. She'd scanned it, her lips pursed. "Well, isn't that ambitious?" she'd said, her tone implying it was foolish. "Sterling and I always felt a state school would be more appropriate for your circumstances, Colette. We could have helped with that. This is simply not feasible." The unspoken message was clear. Stay in your lane. Don't get ideas above your station. When I told them a month later that I'd received the prestigious Dean's Scholarship, covering my full tuition, their congratulations were thin and brittle. "How resourceful of you, dear," Sterling had said, a strange look in his eyes. "To find a way to manage it all on your own." It wasn't praise for my hard work. It was relief that they wouldn't have to foot the bill, that their token educational trust for my branch of the family would remain untouched. These memories played on a loop, each one a fresh cut, but threaded through them were warmer, softer memories. Memories of Grandma Rose. Her house smelled of cinnamon and old books. She never patted my head. She would cup my face in her soft, wrinkled hands and look into my eyes as if I were the most important person in the world. We would spend hours in her overgrown garden, her telling me stories. She spoke often of her grandfather, Theodore Blackwood, the man who had built the family fortune from nothing. "He was a brilliant man, Colette," she'd say, her eyes distant, "but he had 2 sons, and they were as different as night and day. My father, William, came from the line of Jonathan, the scholar. Your Uncle Sterling comes from the line of Reginald, the shark." She'd often get a sad, faraway look. "There was a great injustice done, a long time ago," she would murmur, pruning a wilting rosebush. A shadow fell between the brothers. When I would press her for details, she would just shake her head and smile. "The truth has a way of finding the light, sweet girl. You just have to be patient enough to see it. At the time, I thought they were just stories, the ramblings of an old woman romanticizing the past. I didn't understand that she was planting seeds. The wall I was building around my heart was almost complete when the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but the area code was local. I almost let it go to voicemail, but for some reason I answered. Colette, it's your Aunt Priscilla. My stomach clenched. Her voice was syrupy sweet, a tone she only used when she wanted something. It had been nearly a month since the funeral, and this was the first time she had called. I knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that this was not a condolence call. Hello, Aunt Priscilla, I said, my voice flat. Darling, I know it's been a difficult few weeks for you, she began, the platitude sounding hollow and rehearsed. And we've all been so worried. But I was calling because we're having our annual Founders Day garden party next month, and I had the most wonderful idea. I waited, my knuckles white on the phone. You know your little baking business? It's so charming. And I thought, what a wonderful way to honor your grandmother's memory, and for you to feel included. Would you be a dear and handle the catering for the desserts? We'd pay you, of course, your usual rates. I was silent. The audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a punch to the gut. She wasn't just asking me to work her party. She was framing it as a favor to me, a way for me to feel included. After they had publicly and profoundly excluded me from their grief, from our family, she wanted to hire me as the help. She wanted to pay me to watch them celebrate the legacy of a founder whose other descendants they treated like dirt. The message was as clear as it was cruel. This is your place. You serve. We feast. Something inside me, something that had been weeping and bruised for weeks, went very, very still. The hollow ache in my chest began to fill with something else, something cold and hard and sharp. It was resolve. I'll have to get back to you, Aunt Priscilla, I said, my voice unnervingly calm. I need to check my calendar. I hung up the phone before she could reply. I stood there, my hand still on the receiver, and my eyes fell on the rusty key on my desk. Grandma Rose's words echoed in my head. A great injustice. The truth has a way of finding the light, and for the first time, the key didn't look like an insult. It looked like a weapon. It looked like a promise. The grief was still there, a low thrumming bass note, but now there was a new melody playing over it, a sharp, clear note of fury. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself. It was about finding the truth for my grandmother. But as I picked up the key, the cold weight of it feeling different in my hand now, a darker thought surfaced, unbidden. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. The first step was figuring out what the hell the key was for. It was old clearly, and the number stamped on it, 317, was the only clue. My mind, usually so adept at solving academic problems, was a blank. This was a problem of the real world, a world of rust and secrets, not textbooks and theories. I knew I couldn't do it alone. There was only one person I could trust, someone who existed completely outside the toxic bubble of my family. It called Liam. Liam had been my best friend since the first day of university. We'd met in a ridiculously hard statistics class, bonding over a shared sense of being completely overwhelmed. He was training to be a paralegal, a job that perfectly suited his meticulous, methodical brain. He was also fiercely loyal, and had a finely tuned detector for injustice. He'd listened with simmering rage over the years, as I'd recounted tales of the Blackwood clan's casual cruelty. He came over that night, a pizza box balanced in one hand and a six-pack of beer in the other. I told him everything, the funeral, the will reading, the rusty key. When I got to Aunt Priscilla's phone call about the garden party, his jaw tightened. She said, "What? She wants you to cater. Colette, that's not a request, that's a power move. She's trying to put you back in your box after you had the audacity to have a death in your side of the family." "I know," I said, my voice quiet. I pushed the key across the coffee table towards him. "But then there's this. Grandma Rose said it was the most valuable thing she owned." Liam picked it up, examining it under the lamplight. He turned it over and over, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It's not a house key. It's too small. And it's not a car key. The cut is too simple. The bow is characteristic of a safe deposit box key from the mid-20th century. Lockbox key, your grandmother called it. A safe deposit box? I said, the idea taking root. But where? There are dozens of banks in Charleston. True, he said, taking a long sip of his beer. But how many of those banks were around 60 or 70 years ago? And how many of them are still in business? This is a research project, Colette. And lucky for you, I love research projects. And so it began. Our evenings were transformed. My apartment became a command center. Liam, with his access to legal databases and his paralegal's tenacity, drew up a list of every bank that had operated in Charleston since 1940. I spent hours at the library, not in the student section, but in the archives, poring over old city directories and microfiche records of newspapers, my eyes blurring from the strain. The first few weeks were a demoralizing slog of dead ends. We'd find a bank that seemed promising, like Palmetto State Savings and Loan, only to discover it had gone bankrupt in 1982, and all its records were destroyed in a fire. Another, the Merchants Bank of the Cooper River, had been bought out, but the acquiring bank had no record of safe deposit boxes from the original institution. Each dead end felt like a confirmation of my family's view of me, a fool chasing a ghost, wasting my time on a piece of junk. I was ready to give up more than once, but Liam's steady presence kept me going. We're just eliminating the wrong answers, Colette, he'd say, highlighting another name on our list. Every no gets us closer to a yes. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday night. Liam was cross-referencing a list of defunct banks with property deeds from the city assessor's office. "I've got something," he said, his voice suddenly sharp with excitement. "It's a long shot, but it's something. Charleston Mercantile and Trust." I'd seen the name before, but we'd dismissed it because it closed its doors in 1958. I know, he said, anticipating my objection. But look, it wasn't a standard acquisition. They were bought by a huge national bank, Consolidated Allied Bank, specifically for their trust department and their high-value client list. The old building was torn down, but the assets, including the contents of the vaults, would have been absorbed. They wouldn't just throw out the contents of a bunch of safe deposit boxes. The liability would be massive. Consolidated Allied Bank. They had a massive modern branch right on Meeting Street. The next morning, I walked in, the key feeling slick with sweat in my pocket. I felt ridiculous, like a child playing dress-up. The bank was all glass and gleaming chrome, a place of silent, efficient commerce. I asked to speak to the branch manager, a severe-looking woman, with perfectly coiffed hair and a nameplate that read Miss Davenport, led me to her office. I explained the situation, feeling more foolish with every word. An old key, a dead grandmother, a bank that hadn't existed for over 60 years. She listened with an expression of polite skepticism. "That's a highly unusual request, Miss Blackwood," she said when I finished. "Our records from that era are in deep archival storage. It's not something we can just look up." I placed the key on her polished mahogany desk. "The number is 317, I said. "Please." It was my grandmother's dying wish. Something in my voice, a note of desperation, or maybe just sheer exhaustion, must have broken through her corporate shell. She sighed, a small puff of air. "Let me make a call." She was on the phone for 20 minutes, speaking in a low, efficient tone, referencing acquisition codes and archival protocols. Finally she hung up and looked at me. "You're not going to believe this," she said, a flicker of genuine surprise in her eyes. "We have it. Box 317, from the Charleston Mercantile Vault. It's in our legacy holding downtown. No one has accessed it since 1957. A wave of dizziness washed over me. It was real. Can I see it?" Her expression hardened again. "It's not that simple. You have the key, yes. But we need more than that. We need a death certificate for the original box holder, and we need legal proof that you are the rightful heir to the contents of that box. The will might be sufficient, but our legal department will have to review it. This could take weeks. Weeks. It felt like a lifetime, but it was a path forward. Liam, my tireless, wonderful friend, sprang into action. He helped me get certified copies of Rose's death certificate. He worked with Mr. Abernathy to get the probate paperwork filed and notarized. We submitted a mountain of documents to Miss Davenport's legal department, and then we waited. It was during that agonizing waiting period that I ran into Beatrice. I was at a small cafe near the university, trying to study, when she walked in. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped one too many times. Her usually perfect makeup was slightly smudged, and there were faint, dark circles under her eyes. She saw me and hesitated, a flicker of conflict on her face. To my surprise, she walked over to my table. "Colette," she said, her voice small. Can I sit down?" I nodded, my own surprise making me mute. She sank into the chair opposite me, clutching her designer handbag in her lap like a shield. "I'm sorry," she blurted out. "About the funeral, the way my parents, the way we all behaved, it was awful." It was the first crack I had ever seen in her perfect facade. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "And I meant it. It's just everything is so suffocating," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "The wedding plans, my fiancé, my parents, they have my entire life mapped out for me, and I feel like I can't breathe." She looked at me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "You're lucky, you know. You got away. You're building your own life." I almost laughed. Lucky, me? But I saw the genuine misery in her eyes. Her cage was gilded, but it was still a cage. We talked for almost an hour. It wasn't a deep, soul-bearing conversation, but it was the first real conversation we'd ever had. And just as she was about to leave, she let something slip, something that made the hair on my arms stand up. "It's going to get even worse," she sighed, gathering her things. "Father is in a terrible mood lately. He's meeting with the lawyers every day, something about restructuring the family trust again. He's always so paranoid about the founding charter and its ambiguous language. He says it's a relic that needs to be ironed out to protect the family's future." The founding charter, ambiguous language. It was a throwaway comment from a distressed cousin, but for me it was a flare in the darkness. It was confirmation. My uncle, the great Sterling Blackwood, was nervous about the very foundation of his wealth, and I was waiting for a bank to give me a key to a box that hadn't been opened since 1957, a box left to me by a woman who spoke of a great injustice. Suddenly, the waiting didn't feel so agonizing. It felt like the calm before a storm. The call from Miss Davenport came on a Thursday morning. "The paperwork has been approved, Miss Blackwood. You can come in at your convenience." My heart hammered against my ribs. I called Liam immediately. "It's time," I said. We went together. Miss Davenport met us at the main branch and drove us to another, older building downtown, one made of granite and marble. She led us down a spiraling staircase, then another, into the belly of the building. The air grew cold and still, smelling of damp stone and old paper. We passed through a massive circular vault door, the kind you see in old movies, and entered a cavernous, dimly lit room, lined with thousands of small, brass-fronted doors. This was the legacy vault. "Here we are," she said, stopping in a far, dusty corner. "Charleston Mercantile Holdings." She pointed to a small door, with the number 317 engraved on it. It was tarnished and dark, but I could see it clearly. My hand was shaking as I held out the key. Miss Davenport inserted her own master key into one lock and turned it. "Now you," she said. I slid the rusty key into the second lock. It resisted for a moment, then, with a grinding shriek that echoed in the silent vault, it turned. The lock disengaged with a solid, satisfying clunk. Miss Davenport pulled open the small door, and behind it was a long, narrow metal box. She slid it out. It was heavier than I expected. She carried it to a small private viewing room nearby, and set it on a wooden table. "I'll leave you to it," she said, closing the door softly behind her. It was just me and Liam. We stared at the box for a long moment. "Well," he said, his voice hoarse, "here goes nothing." I took a deep breath and lifted the lid. There was no treasure inside, no glittering jewels, no stacks of cash, no gold bars, The box was filled with paper. On top was a thick leather-bound folio, the leather cracked and dry with age. Embossed on the cover in faded gold leaf were the words, "The Blackwood Family Trust, Founding Charter, 1888. My breath caught in my throat. Beneath the folio was a stack of letters, at least 20 of them, tied with a faded blue ribbon. The handwriting on the top envelope was unmistakable. It was my grandmother's, and it was addressed to me. We didn't speak. We packed the contents carefully into my satchel and left the bank, blinking in the bright afternoon sun. The world felt unreal, distant. We went back to my apartment, drew the blinds, and laid everything out on my coffee table. The air was electric with unspoken questions. I untied the ribbon from the letters first. The top one was dated just 6 months before Rose's death. "My dearest Colette," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I have passed on, and you have found the courage to follow my breadcrumbs. I am so sorry to have left you with a burden, but it is also a birthright. Forgive an old woman her theatrics, but I could not risk this falling into the wrong hands. Your Uncle Sterling would have buried it forever. The story of our family, the real story, is in that folio. The truth of the great injustice I told you about is in your hands now. Your great-grandfather, Jonathan, was a good man, a scholar. His brother Reginald was a predator. He preyed on his own brother's trust. Do not let his descendants do the same to you. Be brave. The truth is your shield and your sword. All my love, Grandma Rose." My hands were trembling as I opened the leather folio. Liam leaned in close, his reading light casting a pool of gold on the ancient, yellowed paper. The charter was written in elaborate, looping script, a work of art in itself. It was dense with the legalese of the 19th century, but we painstakingly worked our way through it. The core of it was an ironclad clause, drafted by the family patriarch, Theodore Blackwood himself. Upon his death and the death of his two sons, Jonathan and Reginald, the trust and the entire Blackwood fortune was to be divided into two equal and perpetual lines of inheritance, 50% for the lineage of Jonathan, 50% for the lineage of Reginald. It was clear, simple, and undeniable. My branch of the family was supposed to be as wealthy as Sterling's. The educational fund was a lie. But that wasn't all. Tucked into a sleeve at the back of the folio was another document. This one was typewritten, dated 1925. It was titled Amended Charter of the Blackwood Family Trust. This document was a masterpiece of legal deception. It cited a fictitious addendum and claimed that due to Jonathan's scholarly disinterest in worldly affairs, the original charter had been revised. It restructured the inheritance, creating a small fixed educational stipend for Jonathan's line, while transferring the entire controlling interest and the vast bulk of the assets to the line of Reginald. It was signed by both brothers, Jonathan and Reginald. "It's a forgery," Liam breathed, his eyes wide. He pointed to Jonathan's signature. "Look at it. It's close, but it's not right. The pressure is too even. It's a careful drawing of a signature, not a natural signature." Liam, in his paralegal work, had taken a course on forensic document analysis. He knew what he was looking at. The letters from Grandma Rose filled in the rest of the story. She had spent the last 30 years of her life quietly piecing it together. Her father, William, had been told by his uncle Reginald that the stipend was a great act of generosity, his entire inheritance. William, a gentle and trusting man like his father Jonathan, never questioned it. He lived a modest life as a history professor, always feeling like he'd failed to live up to the Blackwood name, never knowing that the name itself had been stolen from him. Rose had found the original charter's location through a cryptic entry in her father's diary, mentioning a final truth deposited at the mercantile. She had no legal standing to access it, while her relatives controlled the estate, so she waited. She left the key, the one thing they would overlook, the one thing they would dismiss as junk, to me. We sat there in the quiet of my apartment, the weight of 100 years of deceit laid bare on my coffee table. The scholarship kid, the charity case, it was all a lie, a deliberate, calculated, century-long lie to keep my branch of the family poor and powerless. A cold, hard anger, pure and clean, settled over me. This was bigger than a snub at a funeral. This was grand larceny on a generational scale. My first instinct was to call Uncle Sterling and scream at him, but Liam put a hand on my arm. "No," he said, his voice firm. "Not yet. They don't know that you know. Right now, you have all the power. The moment you show your hand, they'll start moving against you. We need a plan." He was right. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the one reacting to them. I was the one with the secret. So I did the hardest thing I've ever had to do. I did nothing. I went back to my classes. I baked my cakes. I waited tables. And I waited. A week later, my phone buzzed, a voicemail from Uncle Sterling. "Colette." His voice was strained, the usual boom replaced with a tight, controlled tone. "Your aunt and I are becoming rather concerned. We haven't heard from you. I do hope you've reconsidered your position on the garden party. It would be a shame for there to be any unpleasantness." It wasn't a question, it was a threat. 2 days after that, a text from Caspian, "Playing hard to get over a catering gig? It's not a good look, cousin. Dad's not happy." They were prodding the bear, trying to get a reaction. They thought my silence was about the party. They thought it was a pathetic little protest that they could crush with a bit of pressure. They had no idea that I wasn't the bear. I was the one holding the rifle, and I was about to show them just how steady my aim was. The next morning, Liam and I walked into the offices of a man named Marcus Harris. He was a partner at a small boutique law firm that specialized in trust and estate litigation. He was a friend of one of the senior partners at Liam's firm, and he came with a reputation for being a shark with a conscience. He only took cases where he believed his client was unequivocally in the right. He was in his late 60s, with a shock of white hair, piercing blue eyes, and an expression that suggested he'd seen every form of human greed imaginable, and was not impressed by any of it. We laid the documents out on his vast oak desk, the original 1888 charter, the forged 1925 amendment, and a selection of Grandma Rose's letters. He read through them in complete silence, his face unreadable. He spent a full 10 minutes examining the two signatures on the amendment through a jeweler's loupe. Finally, he sat back, took off his reading glasses, and looked at me. "Miss Blackwood," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this isn't a discrepancy. This is a dynasty built on a felony. The forgery is blatant, amateurish by today's standards, but likely convincing in an era before forensic analysis was common. The original charter is unambiguous." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the room. "Your great-uncle Reginald didn't just cheat his brother, he stole his legacy, and his descendants have been profiting from that crime ever since." Liam and I exchanged a look. It was one thing for us to believe it, it was another to hear it stated so baldly by a man like Marcus Harris. "So what do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We have two options," Harris said, steepling his fingers. "Option A is the public route. We file a lawsuit to have the 1925 amendment nullified on grounds of fraud. We'll get forensic analysis, handwriting experts, historical document authentication. It will take years. It will cost hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. It will be a vicious, ugly, public spectacle. You will almost certainly win, but they will drag your name, your father's name, and your grandmother's name through the mud." He let that sink in. "They will try to break you." My stomach turned. That was exactly what they would do. "And option B?" Liam asked. A slow, wolfish smile spread across Mr. Harris's face. "Option B is much more elegant. We don't go to court, we go to war, quietly. A family like yours, in a city like Charleston, is built on two things: money and reputation. The money, they think, is secure, but their reputation is everything. The idea that the great Blackwood family, the paragons of old Charleston society, built their fortune on a cheap forgery, that their sainted ancestor was a common thief, they will pay anything to keep that quiet." The path forward was clear. I wasn't interested in a public circus. I didn't want revenge in the headlines. I wanted justice, on my own terms. "Option B," I said, my voice firm. Mr. Harris nodded, his eyes gleaming. "Excellent. Then it's time to light the fuse." That afternoon, from Mr. Harris's office, I composed a single, simple email. It was addressed to Uncle Sterling, Aunt Priscilla, and the family's head lawyer, a man whose name I'd gotten from the board associate at the will reading. The subject line was Blackwood Family Trust. The body of the email was 2 sentences long. I would like to schedule a meeting to discuss a discrepancy I have discovered regarding the founding charter of the family trust. I believe it is in everyone's best interest to resolve this privately. And then the fuse. I attached a single file, a high-resolution, 1200 dpi scan of the signature page from the original 1888 charter. I hit send. For 3 hours, there was silence. I imagined the email arriving, the initial confusion, the click as they opened the attachment, the dawning horror as they saw Theodore Blackwood's bold, flourishing signature, a signature they had probably only ever seen on the forgery. The silence was the sound of their world tilting on its axis. Then the storm broke. My phone began to ring. It was Uncle Sterling. I let it go to voicemail. He called again, and again, and again, 5 times in a row. Then the text started, a stream of furious, panicked messages. Where did you get that? What is the meaning of this? This is blackmail. You are trying to destroy this family. I didn't respond. I simply watched the notifications pile up, a small, cold knot of satisfaction tightening in my chest. Then a new number called. It was Aunt Priscilla. I ignored it. She left a voicemail, her voice thick with manufactured tears. Colette, darling, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but you are tearing this family apart. You're being cruel and selfish. Have you thought for a moment what this kind of stress will do to your uncle's heart? What this will do to Beatrice's wedding plans? It's for the good of the family to just let this go, darling. Some things are best left in the past. The manipulation was so predictable, so transparent, it was almost pathetic. They were using the same old tools: guilt, family loyalty, my supposed concern for their well-being. But the tools were broken now. They had no effect. It was like watching a magician try the same failed trick over and over again, not realizing the audience knows exactly where the coin is hidden. The most surprising call came late that night. It was Beatrice. Her voice was thin and shaky. Colette, what did you do? I thought about lying, about being evasive, but I was done with games. I found the truth, Beatrice, I said simply. The original trust charter, the real one. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. My father. He's in his study, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I can hear the shredder. He's been shredding documents for an hour. Mother is locked in her bedroom. She says you've ruined us. Another pause. They canceled my engagement party. Arthur's family called this afternoon. They said they heard rumors of significant financial instability and they think it's best to postpone things. I waited for the accusation, for her to scream at me, to blame me for blowing up her perfect life. But it never came. Instead, what she said next stunned me. He's blaming you. My father is running around the house, red in the face, saying you're a vindictive little snake. But, the way he's acting, he's not angry, Colette. He's terrified. Her voice broke. It's true, isn't it? Everything, it's all built on a lie. Yes, I said softly. It is. Oh God, she whispered. And then she hung up. In that moment, I felt a sliver of something that wasn't anger or satisfaction. It was a strange, hollow pity. Her gilded cage had just evaporated, and she was left standing in the wreckage, realizing it was never a home at all. The power had shifted. The foundations of their world were crumbling, and all it took was one rusty key, and the courage to turn it. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. They had wanted it at the mansion, on their home turf. Mr. Harris refused. I had wanted it at my apartment, to really rub their noses in the life they'd consigned me to. Mr. Harris refused that too. No, he'd said, this is not about emotion, this is about power. We hold the meeting here, in my world, by my rules. His conference room was on the top floor of his building, a sleek, minimalist space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the whole of Charleston Harbor. It was a room designed to intimidate, to make you feel small against the vastness of the sky and sea. I sat at the long, polished table with Mr. Harris to my right, and Liam, who had taken the day off to be there, to my left. I was wearing a simple, well-tailored black dress I'd bought the day before, the most expensive piece of clothing I'd ever owned. It was my armor. They arrived precisely on time. Uncle Sterling, Aunt Priscilla, and Caspian. They were followed by their lawyer, the same man I had emailed, whose face was a grim, stony mask. The three of them looked diminished. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a brittle, defensive posture. Sterling's face was pale and puffy. Priscilla's eyes were red-rimmed, and she clutched a Chanel bag to her chest like a life raft. Caspian, for the first time in his life, looked utterly lost, his usual smirk replaced by a look of bewildered fear. They sat opposite us. The silence in the room was thick and heavy. Sterling cleared his throat, attempting to seize control of the narrative one last time. "Now see here, Colette," he began, his voice a poor imitation of its usual boom. "This entire situation is a ridiculous fantasy. You come in here with some dusty old paper you found God knows where," and Mr. Harris held up a hand, and Sterling fell silent, as if physically struck. "That will be quite enough, Sterling," Harris said, his voice dangerously soft. He slid a single, elegantly bound portfolio across the table. It landed in front of their lawyer with a quiet, definitive thud. "In that portfolio," Harris continued, "you will find a copy of the original, notarized 1888 charter of the Blackwood Family Trust. You will also find a full forensic analysis from a court-certified expert, confirming that the 1925 amendment is a forgery and that the signature of Jonathan Blackwood was traced. You will find copies of correspondence from my client's grandmother detailing her decades-long suspicion of this fraud. And finally," he paused, leaning forward slightly, "you will find a preliminary accounting of what my client's branch of the family is owed. That includes her rightful 50% share of the trust's assets, plus compound growth and damages, calculated over 98 years. Their lawyer opened the portfolio. He read the first page of the forensic report, and I saw the last bit of color drain from his face. He slowly turned it around for Sterling to see. Sterling stared at it, his mouth opening and closing silently like a fish. Priscilla let out a small, strangled gasp. Caspian just stared, his jaw slack, the numbers on the page seemingly beyond his comprehension. The figure was astronomical. It wasn't just a fortune, it was the fortune. Their houses, their cars, their club memberships, their entire identity. It was all paid for with stolen money. My money. Their lawyer looked at Sterling, then at me, then back at the report. He quietly closed the portfolio. "I strongly advise my clients to listen to whatever proposal you are about to make," he said to Mr. Harris, his voice flat with defeat. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted completely. It was a black hole, and all the light and energy in the universe was now on my side of the table. I was no longer the scholarship kid. I was no longer the charity case. I was the woman who owned them. I leaned forward, my hands clasped on the table. For the first time, I spoke, and my voice was as calm and steady as the horizon over the harbor. "This was never about the money," I said, looking each of them in the eye. "It was about my grandmother being made to feel small her whole life. It was about her father, my great-grandfather, being remembered as a fool who gave away his birthright. It was about my father dying, thinking he was a footnote in his own family's history. It was about me being patted on the head like a dog while you praised your children's trust funds." I paused, letting the words hang in the silent room. It was about the truth. I leaned in a little closer, and my voice dropped, the calm giving way to a new, harder edge. "But now it is about the money too." Mr. Harris took it from there, his voice crisp and businesslike. He laid out our terms. There would be no lawsuit. The fraud would remain a private family matter. In exchange, they would sign a legally binding agreement, effective immediately. The trust would be completely restructured, restoring my branch's 50% ownership under the control of a new neutral trustee. A significant portion of their personal assets, their homes, their stock portfolios, their art collections, would be liquidated and transferred to me as settlement for retroactive damages. They would not be left destitute. but they would be left without the obscene wealth that had defined them. They would have to live like normal people. They had a choice. They could sign and maintain the public facade of the Blackwood name, or they could refuse, and Mr. Harris would walk the entire portfolio, criminal fraud charges included, over to the district attorney's office that afternoon. There was no negotiation, there was only the quiet scratch of a pen as Sterling, his hand trembling, signed away a century of lies. In the end, it was never a choice. They signed. Their reputation, the carefully constructed myth of the Blackwood family, was the only real currency they had left, and they couldn't bear to see it go bankrupt. The fallout was quiet but catastrophic for them. The official story, spun by a team of public relations experts, was a tale of reconciliation, a joyful reunification of the two great branches of the Blackwood family. But Charleston is a small town built on whispers, and the truth, or at least a version of it, seeped out. The sudden restructuring of the trust, the sale of the ancestral mansion, their abrupt withdrawal from the boards of several high-profile charities, people talked. Their friends, the ones who had flocked to their parties and laughed at Sterling's booming jokes, fell away. The invitations stopped coming. The phone stopped ringing. Their world, once a glittering constellation, shrank to a single dim point. Uncle Sterling and Aunt Priscilla moved into a townhouse on the less fashionable side of town, a property they'd always owned but referred to as the rental. Caspian, stripped of his allowance and his trust fund, was forced to get a job. I heard through the grapevine he was working in sales for a luxury car dealership, a karmic irony that was not lost on me. They weren't poor, not by any normal standard, but they were no longer rich. They were just people, and for them, that was a fate worse than death. And me? I didn't buy a sports car or a penthouse. I didn't throw a lavish party to celebrate. The first thing I did was pay off my student loans. I watched the six-figure balance on my account vanish with a single click, and I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I didn't even realize I'd been carrying. The second thing I did was establish the Rose Blackwood Foundation, endowing it with enough money to provide full no-strings-attached scholarships for dozens of students at my university every single year. Real scholarships, not token handouts. I didn't want the mansion. It was a house built on lies, and I wanted no part of it. Instead, I bought my grandmother's little bungalow. The mortgage company was about to foreclose on it, and I bought it outright for cash. It's small, and the floors creak, but it's filled with light and love. Liam helped me repaint the walls, and I'm slowly restoring her overgrown garden, one rosebush at a time. A few months after the meeting, Beatrice came to see me. She knocked on the door of the bungalow one Saturday afternoon, looking hesitant. Her designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her engagement was officially off. She'd gotten a job as an unpaid intern at a local art gallery, something she'd always wanted to do, but had been told was unsuitable. She apologized for everything, for the Christmases, for the head pats, for her silence. It was a quiet, awkward, but genuine apology. We're not friends, not really. The chasm between our lives is too wide to be bridged so easily. But there's an understanding, a fragile peace. So now, I'm sitting here, in my grandmother's garden, drinking tea from a beautiful porcelain cup that isn't chipped. The old rusty key sits on my desk inside. It's my reminder. They looked at that key and saw junk, a symbol of my insignificance. They couldn't have been more wrong. It wasn't a key to a box of money. It was a key to the truth. And the truth, it turns out, is the one thing old money can't buy, and the one thing it can't survive. They say living well is the best revenge. I'm not sure if that's true, but I have to admit, as I sit here in the quiet peace of a life I built for myself on a foundation of reclaimed truth, that justice feels an awful lot like the sweetest revenge I could have ever imagined. So I want to ask you, have you ever been the one your family underestimated? Have you ever had that moment where you knew you had to be the one to break a toxic cycle? Tell me your story in the comments below. I'll be reading them, because I think it's important we know we're not alone. And if you found some satisfaction in this story, please like and subscribe. because everyone deserves to see a bully finally get exactly what they deserve.